Kia ora everyone, and welcome to this week's International Marketing Monday. Today we'll be exploring the recent New Zealand election and its potential impacts. It is presented by Mia, Reece, and me, Wobblyspoon. So last month, New Zealand had a general election to figure out what the government is going to look like for the next 3 years. And like every good video essay, we're going to start by going 200 years into the past. So New Zealand's government was formed after Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, was signed in 1840. The treaty was between the indigenous Māori chiefs and British settlers on behalf of big old Queenie Vicky, or Queen Victoria, as she was more commonly known. The treaty was meant to establish a governor of New Zealand, whilst allowing Māori people equal rights under the British Crown, as well as protecting them from the gross French, which I'm sure we can all get behind. In practice, however, the treaty was shoddily translated, leading to the Māori translation giving more rights to the Māori people than the English version did. And of course, when all was signed and done, the British used the English version of the treaty, and Māori people received less rights than they signed for. And because of this, throughout the country, Māori land was stolen, the people subjugated, and the culture was stomped out. And after almost 200 years, Māori people are still suffering under this unfair treatment. Te Tiriti o Waitangi remains to this day a contentious topic, being the basis for many policies for our parties. And speaking of those parties, I'd say it's time to introduce them.
For the last 6 years, New Zealand has been under the leadership of the centre-left-wing Labour Party. Labour was voted into government in 2017 and joined a coalition with the far-right New Zealand First Party to gain a majority. Jacinda Ardern, then leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister of New Zealand, gained worldwide recognition after her excellent handling of the Christchurch terror attacks and the COVID-19 epidemic. Support for her leading up to the 2020 elections was overwhelming, and she led Labour to a landslide win, with the party receiving almost 50% of the vote alone and gaining a majority of the seats in Parliament. Since then, however, support for the party has dwindled. They barely used the power they had, despite the fact they could have passed any bill they wanted, and broke a few promises along the way. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it, Atrioc? One notable example was the capital gains tax, a policy which Labour campaigned with, then promptly ruled out once they were in power, along with ruling out a wealth tax. These blows came during the country's ongoing cost of living crisis, leading to the right-wing viewing Labour as incompetent and the left viewing it as ineffective. To make things worse, Jacinda Ardern announced in January 2023 that she would be resigning as Prime Minister, being replaced with the much less popular Chris Hipkins. The leader of the opposition and the other biggest party in the country is the centre-right National Party. For the last few years, National has been doing nothing but whining about Labour. They plan to abolish the Māori Health Authority, an organisation dedicated to managing healthcare for overlooked Māori people, reintroduce fees on prescription medicine, increase the cost of public transport for young or disabled people, reduce sick leave, allow no-cause evictions, and introduce tax relief for those poor, disadvantaged landlords. All of this and more during a cost of living crisis specifically to oppose Labour's policies. They also want to spend $30 million on increasing road speed limits, a decision which experts say will actually endanger people. Why? Because Labour spend a bunch of money decreasing speed limits to make roads safer. Now, because our political system is at least halfway decent, we have more than two parties. Introducing the other major political parties, starting with the Greens. The most left-wing of all the major parties, they've received a boost in support from leftists after Labour's recent failure to do literally anything, with policies such as a wealth tax, porgies, free dental care, and a general focus on helping minority groups, Māori, queer, disabled, Pacifica, and more. They are also possibly the only party to actually give a shit about the climate crisis. Sitting next on the left wing is Te Pāti Māori, the Māori Party. As you may have guessed, their main focus is policies that benefit the Māori community. One of their core beliefs is that the government should be run using the Māori translation of Te Tiriti rather than the English version. As such, they tend to secure a lot of votes from Māori people and activists. Moving on to the other side of the political spectrum, we have the ACT Party, aka National 2 Neoliberal Edition. ACT is essentially an edgier version of National, being very anti-union, insert ACLU joke here, wanting to slash funding for basically all ministries that help New Zealanders in some way. Not to mention their leader, unparalleled genius David Seymour, recently caught flack for wanting to blow up the Ministry of Pacific Peoples.
In my fantasy, we'd send a guy called Guy Fawkes in there and it'll be all over, but we'll probably have to have a more formal approach than that.
I don't believe that making jokes about blowing people up is a particularly funny or responsible thing for political leaders to do.
Does he believe the ACT Party leader's comments regarding the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, that he would send a guy called Guy Fawkes in there and it'll all be over, has the potential to incite violence against Pacific people and the ministry itself?
Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated, I believe that political leaders all have a responsibility to be careful in the language that they use. I don't think that making statements, even if they were poorly intended in humour, about blowing people up is the sort of thing that responsible political leaders should do.
David Seymour, supplementary.
Does the Prime Minister then stand by the factually incorrect statement he made to Newshub on Saturday, quote, "The idea that you'd make a joke about blowing up an ethnic minority is something that isn't really that funny," end quote. And if he does not stand by that statement, then will he apologise for consuming confusing government waste and a story about a government department with a race of people, turning a debate into something it never needed to be?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do. Because as I have also said publicly, I believe that member is deliberately and wantonly playing the race card in this election, and he should be ashamed of himself.
Following this, the ministry staff suffered abuse and one Māori politician had her home invaded, and Seymour still took zero accountability. Somehow even worse than that, however, is New Zealand's own special version of the Republicans, presenting the far-right New Zealand First Party, featuring special guest, the Kingmaker, the Wildcard, the eighth wonder of the world, Winston Peters. Peters is insanely xenophobic, once saying, quote, "Two Wongs don't make a white." He's voted against same-sex marriage, opposes the right of trans people to go to the bathroom, and once claimed that Jacinda Ardern knew about the Christchurch terror attacks before they happened, which, no, she didn't. And he was also Deputy Prime Minister when he said this. The party itself boasts fantastic policies like removing the country from the terrible clutches of the United Nations and World Health Organization, putting a 2-year cap on disability benefits for disabled people, and removing, quote, woke investment rules. That's an exact quote from their website. If you don't know what that means, that's okay, I'm sure they don't either. And if all that wasn't bad enough, now it's time to move on to the many fringe alt-right parties that popped up during this year's election. Out of the 17 parties running in the 2023 election, 8 of those parties were brand new and ran exclusively off a platform of anti-SJW, anti-vaccine, anti-human rights nonsense. 8 of them. The only one even remotely unique is the Women's Rights Party, which sounds admirable until you realise they're just fucking TERFs. The Freedoms Party is led by everyone's favourite cultist, Brian Tamaki, a man who has become a bit of a meme in New Zealand. He's one of those alt-right fundamentalist Christian nutjobs, famous for saying that New Zealand's abundance of women in political positions is, quote, the work of the devil, that Cyclone Gabrielle was caused by porn, abortion and gay rights, who calls himself the tangible expression of God, and in 2006 and in 2007 was ranked the least trusted person out of 75 prominent New Zealanders.
So before we explain the results of the election, I'm going to explain how the New Zealand Parliament works. So here in New Zealand, Parliament is usually made up of 120 members of Parliament, MPs. And this is formed using mixed member proportional representation, which works a bit differently than in places like the US and is more similar to Germany, for example. You see, each voter gets 2 votes. One is an electorate vote, and the other is a party vote. Then 72 of the 120 seats are decided by the electorate vote, 65 of which are the general electorate, and 7 are part of the Māori electorate. So these electorates are regions of equal population, which each have their own candidates from different parties that people vote for, depending on who they want to represent their region. And whichever candidate has the most votes, and their electorate gets a seat in Parliament. For the Māori electorates, Māori people can choose to either vote in the general electorates or the Māori electorates that they're in. And as nobody else can vote for these seats, it guarantees a certain proportion of Māori representation and interests in Parliament. The idea of a small Māori representation in Parliament was initially created to prevent Māori from influencing any other part of the government. However, currently it can be more positive as other parties and MPs are also concerned with Māori affairs. The other 48 seats are decided by the party vote. So you vote for one of the parties, and then these 48 seats are divvied up depending on the proportion of total votes each party got, as long as these parties got at least 5% of the vote or they won an electorate. For example, if a party won 40 electorates and got 50% of the party vote, they would get 40 electorate seats and 20 list seats, so 60 seats overall. There you go, 50% of the 120 seat parliament. And these seats are filled by MPs representing that party. Parties aren't just content with getting a couple seats, they want the majority so they can run things their way. And since 2020 is the only time under the MMP system a single party has had a majority, they almost always have to form coalitions with other parties that share similar views to accomplish this majority. And now Mia will explain the results.
Kia ora all, my name is Mia, or Mia Low in chat. I use she/they pronouns, and I'm here to break down the election itself for you now that you're familiar with the parties and the system. Honestly, it's not looking good, I'm gonna be real. Since the start of the year, the left has known that this will be a pretty rough election. Chris Hipkins has never really had Jacinda Ardern's charisma or popularity, and honestly, even when she stepped down, her support had dwindled drastically. It wasn't looking good. So it wasn't really a surprise when the pre-election polls, which started roughly a month out from election night, showed National and ACT winning by a large majority. Labour was predicted to fall down below 30% of the total party vote, even though Greens did steal a fair portion of Labour's share. Honestly, some polls even predicted Greens would have 16 seats from a previous high of 11, which was nice, but it wasn't enough. This whole debacle was made a lot worse in the first leaders debate, with Chris Hipkins coming in with a brilliant strategy where he agreed with Chris Luxon on nearly every topic. It was a bit of a disaster. Labour was not convincing any centrists or any of the swing voters to their side, and honestly, pretty discouraging for the left-wing voters that really cared about the issues that Labour was kind of abandoning. However, a few weeks before the election, Labour realised they needed to switch things up. Hipkins went on the offensive. He started to pivot towards the left wing, trying to regain voters who had lost faith, and in the polls, Labour's numbers started going up. Hipkins did have COVID at one point. He missed a critical leaders debate. However, there was hope to be had that maybe New Zealand wouldn't succumb to a right-wing landslide. As such, in the days leading up to election night, we were uncertain who would come out on top. Labour was doing better, and people started to question if New Zealand First would again be the kingmaker for this election. As a result, both blocs tried to make New Zealand First irrelevant. National and ACT were generally dismissive of Winston Peters. They didn't rule out a coalition, though. On the other hand, Labour and the left bloc stated they had no intentions of forming a coalition with New Zealand First, even if it would give them a majority. Regardless, on both sides, there was a palpable tension. For the first time this year, it felt like the election could really go either way. And now, election night, 14th of October. The preliminary results are in. So who won? Honestly, pretty much everyone bar Labour. Every single party aside from Labour gained more seats in Parliament than previously. However, National and ACT clearly were dominant above all else. National had 50 seats, a lot more than the polls predicted, and with ACT they had a total of 61, which is just enough to secure government by themselves, by one seat, avoiding the coalition of chaos. Labour had performed exceptionally poorly, the only party in government to lose seats, and while Te Pāti Māori and the Greens had done well, it wasn't really well enough. The fringe parties also flopped. New Zealand Loyal predicted they would receive 2 million votes, which they fell short of by 1,974,000 votes. Even combined all of the those extreme right-wing fringe parties together, they received under 2% of the vote, which led to some hilarious outrage from Brian Tamaki and his peers. While the extremists were clearly ruled out, the fates of the big parties weren't quite sealed yet. Special votes are yet to be counted. For those who don't know, special votes are votes for people who enrolled on the day of the election, or those who submitted from overseas. On top of this, all votes were recounted, ensuring better accuracy for the data, which would overall take 3 weeks to count, so there was still hope for us. On November the 3rd, the final results were announced. The left bloc had generally performed well in the past in special votes, and this year was no different. Final results showed Te Pāti Māori gaining 2 seats, the Greens gaining 1, and National losing 2. Even still, in saying that, every single party in the Parliament gained seats aside from Labour. They're still the biggest loser of the election. Nothing's really changed that. However, these new results were still a big switch-up. Importantly, Te Pāti Māori's gains were particularly significant. They won more electorate seats than their share of the total party vote, meaning that Parliament was in an overhang with 122 total seats. As such, National and ACT no longer had a majority. Winston, god damn it, once again, it's a wild card. It's likely that these three parties will enter the coalition of chaos. However, it is possible, if unlikely, that alternative scenarios play out. It is possible that Winston could side with the left bloc to form a government, or that National and Labour could make some kind of fucked up deal. Honestly, it makes more sense than you'd think. Their policies are pretty similar, National and Labour's. Their biggest problem is that their campaigns often revolve around shitting on one another. There are also some even less likely scenarios, such as National and ACT going into a parliament without forming a government, where no party has a majority. This has never happened before. Honestly, I don't know what it even looked like, but technically it is possible. There's even a tiny possibility of a second election, as many electorates were incredibly close calls with less than 100 votes difference. Regardless of what happens, it's pretty much guaranteed to be bad news. National and ACT will almost certainly hold a large portion of power and will push the direction of our country in a right-leaning direction. The cost of living crisis will not be handled for the everyday New Zealander, and instead landlords and businesses will profit more of the drastic housing crisis, with looser regulations, less taxes to pay, and an increasingly desperate population to leech off of. If Atrioc still wants to buy a house in Queenstown, it'd be a pretty rough time. Honestly, maybe wait a little bit. Maybe don't do it too soon. Give it a little bit. As much as I'd love those New Zealand stream times. But yeah, it's bad news for minorities too. While Nassau has disagreed with ACT and New Zealand First on some of their more outrageous policies, such as policies prohibiting trans people from using preferred bathrooms, thank God they're not going through. It is likely that similar but still harmful policies will sneak through, and that there will be a halt in progressive politics to benefit the most oppressed citizens of Aotearoa. In a time when inflation is skyrocketing, NASA will cut back on welfare policies and public sector employees, while increasing government spending on useless measures such as changing road speeds that were previously lowered a year ago. In general, it's terrible news for the poor, bad news for the large portion of the middle class, and incredible results for the small minority of elites. Just what we goddamn need.
Hey, Reece here again. Just want to say thank you to Atrioc and everyone in chat for watching this video. I hope you all enjoyed it, because I certainly did not.